Hello, this week I will be reviewing Drinking Water, a November 2025 release from Nancy Zeltsman. I'm quite ashamed that it took me this long to listen to this album. I always enjoy listening to Nancy Zeltsman. Unfortunately, the last review I did of a Zeltsman album got a 10 out of 10, so there's actually nowhere to go but down. So we will have to hope that her career can survive. All jokes aside, Nancy writes about this that many familiar musical styles are featured in this collection. Though the specific pieces may be unfamiliar, I hope it's refreshing to make your likely first time connections to this music. I feel the pieces have a reflective quality to them. This is a 54-minute album. The first track on this album is by Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco. It is excerpts from Passatempi, adapted by Nancy Zeltsman. It's 5 minutes long. This is a bright and active start to the album. The marimba sounds very good. I always love Nancy's sound. Such a curious piece, like active scenes from a bustling fictional town. This seems like an immediate gem. It's much more charming than the original piano version. It's one of those times where the marimba imparts a depth that piano can sometimes lack due to its homogeneity and familiarity. This is just so intricate and full of colorful characters. I love it. I think more people, including me, need to play music of this ilk. I'll be trying to get sheet music to this for sure. What a reminder that there is so much music out there. I don't know this composer or this collection of pieces at all, but it's such a good example of the value that marimba can bring to the musical world. Very strong start. From here, we move on into a long series of pieces from Friedrich Wilhelm Zachow. According to my antique dictionary of musicians, he was born in Leipzig, 1663, died in Halle, 1712. He was Handel's teacher, organist, and a composer. Fascinating composer. This is probably the first time I'm hearing any of his music. I think Nancy has played a good amount of, everyone, but a good amount of Handel. I think maybe there's some arrangements in her four mallet book. Handel is already pretty antique, so to hear his precursor, there's a certain emptiness to it. Combined with the B minor key area, it's all a little lonely, a little forlorn. I think the differences from music of 50 years later that we might be more familiar with is that these don't seem to be imitations of forms, but are the forms themselves, if that makes any sense. Like, we're establishing dogma, not in dialogue with it. And yet, there's a fascinating lilting fugue subject here that is just peculiar and lovely. The next track is by Joop Strasser, music for marimba, about 7 minutes long. It's funny, even prior to listening, I feel a trepidation. Music for marimba, not a good idea. The composer will either box themselves into tropes or reach beyond what is even economical for the instrument. Is that what happens in this piece? It does have repeated and recognizable figurations, but none of them arise to the level of motif, which means none of them rise to the level of dialogue or having something to say. It's more just like looking at fragments of a mirror scattered across the ground. I was neither interested, impressed, nor entertained by this. Um, of course, it's such an absurd statement for me to be like, oh, music for marimba? That doesn't sound like a good idea. There's all sorts of thoughts wrapped in my head around what makes good marimba writing versus bad marimba writing. And I don't know if any of you can relate that a title like that just sets off alarm bells. So it's an absurd statement, but it's sometimes how I feel. The marimba is still just so young. You just don't know what you're going to get when people write for it. Track number 6 is also about 7 minutes. It's from pianist Fred Hirsch, kind of a mashup of West Virginia Rose and The Water is Wide, adapted by Nancy Zeltsman, of course. This seems like a different recording session. I don't like the marimba sound as much here. Who knows what changed? So here's more thinking about what the marimba can do well and not do well. More of a discussion of this. I don't think the marimba can play ballads. I think it should be obvious how much I revere Nancy Zeltsman, and for all her touch and musicality, it just seems impossible to get the marimba to have the perseverance of line or lyric that is required for a ballad. Her recording of Misty, when I compared all the times I've had the amazing opportunity to play Misty with Johnny Mathis, it just can't, the marimba just can't touch what is contained in those vocals. So that's a limitation I put on the marimba, which means I heard this piece, this Fred Hirsch arrangement or adaptation, as mostly kind of plodding and unsuccessful. It's so hard to get jazz charts down. I mean, you can hear in the few I've done of like Autumn Leaves and that Herbie Hancock tune, I'm like dying trying to keep the idea of a melody note alive in your head, and sometimes it just dies. Something about it is just very tough. Track 7 is by Moto Fukushima, Star, also adapted from the bass on Purple Music as well, her last album. There was a track from this Japanese born New York City based bassist Moto. I think I echo my comments from the last review. This isn't particularly interesting to me, but Zeltsman has a clarity of purpose with it that's an outstanding example of how effective simplicity can be. Overall, I do think the bass tone provides something to this composition that is not quite replicated by the marimba. Next is Paul Simon Bridge Over Troubled Water, but the arrangement that Jacob Collier did of it, now arranged and adapted by Nancy Zeltsman. This has a lot of the same problems as the previous ballad. I think Jacob Collier probably just needs more than four mallets, to be honest. His maximalist style does not bode well for our limited harmonic choices. Now, this arrangement is very interesting. It's very nimble and covering a lot of harmonic ground. I mean, it has to, but it just thins out too much at key times, and a riff on the marimba just doesn't have the same inflection as a flexible vocalist would have. Why am I pointing this out in direct comparison? Like, why am I making it a competition between different formats of the same artistic, directive? I think it's to contrast how I felt the first selection on this album was actually additive in being transported to marimba. A lot of things are. But when I can't understand, and it is my own understanding that is the limiter here, when I can't understand what's better about listening to this version rather than the original, I just can't give it my full throated support. There's probably a lot to unpack there. Like there's something in my psyche that's kind of competing with the repertoire of other instruments, and like I need marimba to always just be this kind of gem. There's nothing really wrong with just hanging out with a marimba tune that that might not be the most the hugest apotheosis of what marimba can be. But that's where my mind comes from. Track number 9 is Paul Simon Amulet, a beautiful and interestingly contrived piece for solo guitar, then marimba, as can be found in the Intermediate Masterworks Volume 1. No, I don't know how Zeltsman and Paul Simon know each other. I mean, but what a boon for our instrument these intermediate masterworks are. I don't know if the 2008 session implies that this is from Nancy's first recording of it, like for the companion albums to the volumes. It's a very curious piece. It actually, I think, in some ways challenges the things I was just talking about, because it's an effective piece, but it's small in scope and is really speaking through the instrument in a way that is very curious to me. There's not an overarching goal, but if your inner monologue, everything you were feeling in a day or a season, was to just be spoken through an instrument, perhaps it would be this kind of pleasant listlessness and contemplation that you can find in Amulet. Track number 10 is by Antonio Carlos Jobim, Agua de Beber, Drinking Water, title track of the album. Adding in Matt Smallcombe on drums and brushes here. We should all love Jobim, one of the great Brazilian fathers of bossa nova, and this arrangement is a lot of fun. Brushes on drum kit is added in the mix, like I said. This is so Nancy. One of the few times I've heard her play live, I think she played like Ragamuffin, and these just slightly quirky grooves are something she seems to love and excels at. It's nice to have some lighter fare at this point of the album. I think we were dragging for a bit with several very introverted selections. Track 11 is by famous jazz vibraphonist David Friedman, called Inside Outside, with Sharon Leventhal on violin and Leo Martinez on double bass. Interestingly, the longest piece on the album by a solid 5 minutes, and with a lot of musical material to think about. It's by David Friedman. It's kind of jazz adjacent, kind of Lou Harrison adjacent, and kind of Ben Johnston's string quartet adjacent. Someone who's familiar with all those artists and genres, tell me if that makes any sense. All of those connections actually do have ties to this trio in one way or another, so I think I'm being somewhat logical. For large portions of the piece, we are lurking in a kind of mixed meter with some pitch center definition, maybe a modal key area. All that is quickly discarded at times with these kind of intervallic extensions that happen, or pizzicato interjections. Around 7.5 minutes in, the character becomes more frantic, then really retreating into the depths at 9 minutes for the remainder of the piece. A very murky contemplation that I enjoyed quite a bit. It's an interesting piece. I'm not sure what to make of it in entirety. And our final track, track number 12, is by Manuel M. Ponce, Por ti mi corazón, For you my heart, adapted by Nancy Zeltsman. This is perhaps the most successful ballad-ish adaptation on the album, with its effortless glissandi and back and forth imitation. This is quite charming. You can imagine characters like in a love song passing notes back and forth to each other. So those are the 12 tracks. More than anything, as always, when I listen to a mature artist like Nancy Zeltsman, I feel like I learned so much about genres and connections and different people. Just the musical universe that she's downloading and compressing and then presenting is just so edifying to receive and research. So I really love doing these reviews. And I love that process regardless of if the album in particular is something I really like or I think works. It's just so educational for me to get into this music. And indeed, while possessing a lot of the things I love about Nancy Zeltsman, after a very strong start to this project, I feel like the album really takes a dive in the middle, having to slog through several pieces that end up making the album feel a little too long, maybe a little too indulgent. So I was joking about it before, but I am going to give this album a 6 out of 10. As always, Nancy, thank you for your artistic output, and please give me the music to the Passatempi. That was really amazing. What do you think about this album? What do you think about the capabilities of marimba? What should be prioritized in writing and premiering this music? What do you find important? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next week.